They never meant for you to hear this. If you had lived in 1847, your name would have been struck from the record just for listening. Somewhere in the humid shadows of Louisiana, a door was locked, a trap was set, and a truth was buried so deeply that even history pretended it never happened. What you're about to hear isn't a story meant to inspire you. It's meant to warn you. Because power has always experimented on the powerless. Behind every polished era lies a cellar. And in this one, a young woman was lowered into darkness beneath 8 starving dogs, not as punishment alone, but as proof of a philosophy. A belief held by elites across centuries that fear is the purest form of control. That break a human long enough, starve them, isolate them, surround them with violence, and they will become nothing. That was the theory. But history doesn't record what happens when the theory fails. The plantation that housed this experiment no longer exists. Burned, erased, its parish records altered. Its witnesses silenced with money, threats, or early graves. And yet fragments survived, court letters never filed. Journals never published, testimonies too unsettling to destroy entirely. They describe a morning where something impossible walked out of a locked gate, followed not by chains, but by obedience. This is not just a tale of cruelty. It's a case study in hierarchy, psychological domination, and what happens when control systems meet an unbreakable will. Because the Baroness who orchestrated this believed something deeply and dangerously familiar, that authority is natural, suffering is necessary, and submission is inevitable. That belief didn't die with her. You live inside versions of it right now. Institutions designed to condition, starve, threaten, and reward compliance. Systems that train you, like animals, to respond to fear signals. The cellar never went away. It just changed shape. What happened beneath those kennels wasn't magic. It wasn't myth. It was something far more unsettling. A collapse of the power structure itself. And once you understand how it happened, you'll never look at dominance, obedience, or strength the same way again. Listen carefully. This knowledge isn't loud. It doesn't scream, it waits until someone is ready to descend. The woman who ordered the cellar built never believed herself cruel. That's the first lie power tells itself. She believed she was correct, that the world was arranged in tiers, and her position at the top was evidence of moral superiority. Aristocracy didn't just mean wealth to her, it meant natural authority, and anyone beneath her existed to be shaped, corrected, or erased. Her estate functioned less like a home and more like a laboratory. Every rule was designed to observe behavior under pressure. Hunger was calculated. Isolation was deliberate. Uncertainty was the real weapon. Those under her control were never allowed to feel stable because stability breeds identity. Identity is dangerous to systems built on obedience. The dogs were not guards. They were instruments. Raised to respond to dominance cues, deprived just enough to keep them alert, aggressive, and controllable. Fear-bound creatures respond best to hierarchy. That was the Baroness's obsession hierarchy that never questioned itself. And then there was the girl. She did not scream when screamed at. She did not collapse when punished. She learned something most people never do, how power watches, how it studies posture, silence, reaction, how it feeds on emotional leakage. Fear is nourishment to tyrants. Resistance isn't loud, it's disciplined. That's why the Baroness fixated on her. Not because the girl disobeyed, but because she withheld something. A core, an inner refusal to surrender meaning. The Baroness sensed it the way predators sense weakness, but this was the opposite. It was an anomaly. And anomalies must be crushed, not for justice, but to preserve the illusion that the system is flawless. So the cellar wasn't just punishment, it was escalation. The dogs weren't just starving, they were variables. This was an experiment meant to prove a worldview, that all beings, human or animal, ultimately submit to fear. That starvation plus threat equals obedience. That dominance is a law of nature, not a social construct. But here's what history hides in footnotes and burned ledgers. Systems obsessed with control always miscalculate one factor. They assume fear is universal. They forget awareness. The girl had watched the dogs for months. Their feeding rituals, their hierarchy, their responses to posture, stillness, tone. While others looked away, she observed. While others shrank, she studied. This is what power never anticipates, that the oppressed are often the most attentive people in the room. The cellar wasn't the beginning of the story. It was the moment the equation started to break. And once an equation breaks, everything built on it becomes unstable. If you're still listening, it's because you recognize this pattern. Not from history, but from life. From institutions that test how much pressure you'll tolerate before surrendering yourself. What happened next wasn't survival. It was inversion. The descent begins quietly. Darkness isn't just absence of light, it's a revelation of perception. In that cellar, the girl felt it immediately. The thick, damp air pressing against her skin, the uneven earth beneath her feet, the faint vibration of claws on wood overhead. Every instinct screamed to shrink, to hide, to surrender, but surrender wasn't an option. Not yet. Not here. Because fear is only dangerous when it dominates your mind. And she had begun to understand something that the Baroness never would. Fear can be observed, measured, and if controlled, used. She listened to the dogs, 8 massive bodies pacing, sniffing, whispering in their own language of teeth and muscle. Each one trained to recognize authority, to impose dominance, but she had already studied their patterns. Their hunger was predictable, their aggression programmable, and her calmness was the first shock to the system. They had been instruments of submission. She would become an instrument of something else, command. The first hours were a test. Darkness, silence, anticipation. Every passing minute stretched time, but it also revealed the rhythms of her captors. She mapped them. Bourbon, the largest, always led. Savoy, quick and nervous, mirrored Bourbon's choices. Habsburg and Romanov flanked. She could sense the subtle hierarchy forming in real time. Their instincts revealing the exact mechanics the Baroness had relied upon. All that power, all that preparation could be turned, but only if she moved correctly. History doesn't tell you the micro decisions that save lives. It doesn't record the split-second choices, the internal negotiations between fear and focus. And yet these were the moments that defined her. Every breath, every shift of weight, every small adjustment of posture became a language, negotiation with predators who had never met resistance like this before. Outside, the world continued. The Baroness believed she was orchestrating an outcome. A perfect equation. Girl plus fear plus starvation plus predatory instinct. But she underestimated one constant: consciousness. Awareness is the enemy of domination. It sees beyond rules, beyond physicality, beyond expectation. By the midpoint of the second day, the cellar was no longer a trap. It was a laboratory for understanding power itself. She knew that fear could be contained, measured, and even reversed, but only if she refused to comply in the ways they expected. Only if she claimed control of the narrative inside that darkness. And this is where history breaks its silence. The girl did something that no witness, no record, no observer could have anticipated. She prepared not to flee, not to submit, but to turn the instruments of oppression into allies. Not through charm, not through bribery, not through weakness, but through recognition of the hierarchy that the Baroness and her dogs had taken for granted. And now, listener, I want you to participate in this descent. Take a moment. Comment twice below. I see what others ignore. Do it. Let it mark the beginning of your awareness. Let the algorithm know you are no longer passive. Let your mind start aligning with truths hidden in plain sight. Once done, continue reading, because what she did next would redefine the meaning of control, and history itself would never record it fully. Dawn came like a muted threat, not light. The trapdoor above her opened, and the air shifted. The dogs descended, their claws scraping against wood, their breathing sharp, muscles coiled, senses honed to domination. 8 living weapons, each bred for obedience and violence, now faced a single human who, on paper, had no leverage. And yet, leverage existed, but not the kind the Baroness understood. The girl stood perfectly still. Not out of fear, but calculation. Every animal movement, every pause, every sniff of the air was data. Observation had become her weapon. The dogs were trained to punish hesitation, but hesitation requires fear. She had none to give. She had learned their language without speaking it. Every subtle shift in posture communicated her status. She met Bourbon's gaze directly, the alpha of the pack, and did not flinch. Savoy mirrored Bourbon, Romanov and Habsburg mirrored each other, waiting for cues she alone could provide. Power is often mistaken for brute force. But force obeys rules. Power commands respect. That morning in that claustrophobic cellar, she discovered the difference. Hunger, deprivation, training, these were tools of the Baroness. But they could be inverted. She had the clarity to see the hierarchy. And she recognized the one thing the Baroness had ignored. Instinct can be guided, even when it seems absolute. She moved subtly, a step forward, a pause, a tilt of the head. Each dog reacted, and in their reaction, they revealed the structure of their dominance. The girl realized she did not need to conquer them by strength. She needed to position herself inside the system they already understood. Authority, even when unacknowledged, can become a shield. 3 hours passed? Or was it more? Time had fractured. She no longer tracked minutes, only patterns. And within those patterns, she found opportunity. Hunger made the dogs desperate, yes, but desperation is predictable. They craved a target, a direction, a center. By becoming that center, she changed the rules. The alpha no longer dictated. He responded. The flanking dogs no longer threatened. They waited. And then she spoke, just a whisper, low, controlled, almost indistinct. Not command, not pleading, not submission, recognition, respect. The tone was unfamiliar, a frequency that resonated through their instincts. Bourbon's ears twitched, Savoy paused mid-step, the entire pack frozen in a pattern they had never known. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was orchestrating. This was the moment the experiment failed, not through disobedience, but through comprehension. The Baroness had assumed fear was absolute, linear, inevitable. She had assumed that the girl's spirit was disposable, a variable to be crushed. She had not accounted for awareness, for observation, for the mind that refuses to break under predictable terror. By the time the trapdoor above opened fully, what awaited was no longer a prey, no longer a victim. It was something else entirely. A force of calm, focus, and authority that would rewrite the dynamic of that room. This is the point where history stops telling details. Their fragments of journals and letters falter, and only the whispers of witnesses remain. But we know enough. And what we know is enough to understand. Control is never absolute. Power always assumes ignorance. And a mind that refuses to surrender will find a way to invert every rule that was designed to crush it. By mid-morning, the cellar had become a stage, not of chaos, but of precision. The 8 dogs, once instruments of domination, now circled with attention rather than aggression. The girl's presence alone reconfigured the dynamics that the Baroness had assumed immutable. Every step she took, every breath she drew, subtly redirected the pack's instinct. Hunger still sharpened their senses, but it no longer dictated the outcome she did. It's essential to understand what she accomplished in that small dark room. This wasn't mere survival. It was cognitive mastery over a system designed to break the human mind. While the Baroness believed that cruelty and deprivation would produce submission, the girl recognized patterns, predicted behavior, and exploited them. Power, she discovered, is as much about perception as it is about physical dominance. By observing, by calculating, by aligning herself with the instincts of the dogs rather than opposing them, she became untouchable not because they couldn't harm her, but because she had entered their framework of control and assumed the apex without striking. History often mislabels such moments. To the Baroness, it would have appeared as miracle or accident. To the estate staff, it was confusion, unease, and ultimately awe. But in truth, it was the logical outcome of awareness, preparation, and an unyielding refusal to internalize fear as instruction. This is what the Baroness overlooked. Fear is only dangerous when it is unexamined. Awareness transforms it into insight. And insight can turn instruments of oppression into allies, or at least into neutralized threats. Hours passed. The girl remained calm, controlled, and intentional. She did not attempt to flee. She did not try to attack. She studied. She learned. And in that study, she found the key that would allow her not just to survive, but to emerge changed, untouchable, and commanding respect from forces meant to enslave her. And here's where it becomes even more significant. The Baroness had believed she was teaching a lesson. That suffering was the ultimate teacher. But the girl discovered the inverse truth. Suffering is a lens. It reveals what the system cannot erase: the ability to perceive, to adapt, to harness the very tools intended to destroy you. For those watching today, it is the same principle. Every system in society, from institutions to hierarchies, from rules to traditions, assumes compliance. It assumes ignorance. It assumes the weak will submit. But if you study the patterns, observe the predictable behaviors, and position yourself inside the structure rather than outside it, what seems invincible can be neutralized. What seems absolute can be inverted. What seems designed to break you can instead make you unbreakable. And so, halfway through this story, you, the viewer, must engage. Comment twice below. I bend, I do not break. Lock in your awareness. Lock in your presence in this system. Let it mark you as someone ready to see beyond appearances, someone ready to recognize the hidden architectures of power. Do this before we descend further, because the next revelations will test your understanding of control, of fear, and of authority itself. The sun had fully risen, but light in the cellar was a faint, mocking glow through the cracks above. The girl's senses had shifted. Darkness was no longer an enemy. She could feel the dogs breathing, their weight, their micro-movements, every twitch of muscle, every change in scent. The air itself carried information, tension, hunger, anticipation. She was no longer simply a human in a room with predators. She had become the center of a system, the pivot point around which instincts now revolved. The Baroness, observing from above, had expected chaos, screams, panic, blood. Instead, she witnessed something unprecedented. Calm, intentional stillness, awareness. Every dog that descended had a trained response, every step dictated by conditioning. And yet, in that room, conditioning faltered. Bourbon, the alpha, paused mid-step. Savoy Fur rippled with indecision. The pack had never encountered a force that neither submitted nor attacked. Their hierarchy froze, waiting for a signal that only the girl could give. What she was doing in that moment is what history rarely allows itself to record. She was commanding respect without raising her voice, without asserting physical dominance, without triggering fear. It was the purest form of authority, the kind that cannot be imposed, only recognized. The Baroness's tools, instruments of terror for so long, had become inert without her even touching them. The shift was subtle, almost invisible, but it was absolute. And this is where the story becomes dangerous for those who hear it. Because it demonstrates a principle that elites have always feared. Power can be understood, observed, and inverted. What seems absolute, untouchable, or predatory, is often just a system one that can be mapped, analyzed, ultimately neutralized if you understand the rules it operates under. The girl had learned those rules in months of observation. In every punishing act, every threat, every beat of cruelty delivered by the Baroness, she had cataloged weaknesses, calculated responses, and discovered the one constant the Baroness had ignored. The mind is not a tool to be broken. It is a weapon, if you understand it. By the second day, the dogs no longer barked with the intent to dominate. They no longer lunged with trained aggression. They moved in patterns she anticipated, deferred to her subtle signals, and responded to her calm as if she had always been their alpha. Hunger still sharpened their instincts, but instinct without a target is confusion. And she became that target, not as prey, but as authority. It is here that history begins to blur. Observers above could not explain what they saw. Journals recorded a strange calm in the cellar. Letters described her emergence as impossible, unnatural, commanding. The Baroness, whose every assumption had been shattered, would not survive the encounter in the same way. Power that cannot assert control is power that begins to unravel. The lesson is chilling and simple. Systems designed to dominate are not omnipotent. They are predictable. And when you understand the rules they play by, fear itself can become your tool. By the third day, the cellar had become a theater of control flipped inside out. The Baroness thought she commanded the moment, but her assumption was false. Every step the girl took, every blink, every shift of weight dictated the rhythm of the room. 8 dogs, instruments of fear trained to enforce submission, now awaited her signal. Their instincts, honed for centuries of selective breeding, were potent, but they were pliable, and she understood exactly how to bend them. This is the moment when awareness becomes more powerful than brute force. The Baroness had assumed hunger equals obedience. She had assumed terror equals compliance. She had forgotten one thing. The mind is adaptable. It perceives patterns where others see chaos. It recognizes the flow of hierarchy, the subtleties of dominance, the microsecond decisions that determine life and death. And in that damp, claustrophobic space, the girl had claimed mastery of the system. She began moving with intent, small, deliberate steps that corresponded to the dog's instincts. Not aggression, not submission, but command through presence. Bourbon led the way, tense and alert. She positioned herself to acknowledge his authority while simultaneously signaling her own. The alpha adjusted. Savoy mirrored Bourbon. Habsburg, Romanov, Grimaldi, Windsor, Zolan, Medici, they followed the emergent hierarchy. Their predatory instincts momentarily neutralized by recognition of a new center of authority, the Baroness observed, baffled. Her perfect experiment was failing. Tools designed to dominate were no longer instruments. They had become variables she could not predict. And this is what the story teaches. Control only exists when one party assumes ignorance in the other. Fear requires a victim. But once awareness is awakened, the equation inverts. In this quiet, tense symphony, the girl realized she did not need to escape. Escape was irrelevant. Submission was irrelevant. What mattered was presence. Presence redefined the rules of engagement. Hunger, training, and threat. These had been the foundation of power in the Baroness's mind. But all power, no matter how absolute it seems, has blind spots. Instincts can be redirected. Obedience can be deferred. Fear can be reframed. She tested boundaries, inching closer to Bourbon, letting her gaze communicate calm, not challenge, not dominance, awareness, respect. Every movement was a negotiation. The pack responded, shifting formation, deferring to her decisions without violence. It was a perfect inversion of what had been intended. And when she finally stepped to the center of the cellar, fully acknowledged by every creature trained to destroy her, the world above began to shift. The Baroness's tools of terror had been neutralized. The system itself trembled under the weight of one mind refusing to submit. History seldom records these subtleties. It notes outcomes. But the truth, the terrifying, exhilarating truth, is that control can always be inverted if the observer sees the patterns others ignore. The girl had done more than survive. She had mastered the system designed to enslave her. The morning light above the trapdoor shifted. For the first time, it revealed the cellar not as a prison, but as a crucible. The girl had not only survived the instruments of her fear, had become her allies in a silent hierarchy of observation and instinct. 8 massive dogs, trained to dominate, to enforce submission, now waited. Not to attack, but to follow. Not out of affection, but out of recognition. This is the moment that history almost never records the transformation from prey to apex. The Baroness, watching above, could feel the collapse of her assumptions. Fear was supposed to control. Hunger was supposed to bend. Authority was supposed to obey. And yet here stood a single human, calm, centered, commanding without force. Demonstrating a truth the Baroness would never admit: power is fragile when met with understanding. The girl did not shout. She did not threaten. She moved slowly, deliberately, positioning herself at the heart of the formation. Each dog mirrored her awareness. Instincts temporarily redirected by the subtle signals of observation, patience, and recognition. Hunger still sharpened their senses, but desperation without structure is chaos. She became structure. She became center. She became authority. Every moment in the cellar reinforced the principle that has echoed through history, yet is rarely acknowledged. Systems designed to dominate assume ignorance. Fear requires submission. Control is absolute only when the observer accepts their role as victim. Awareness changes that. Awareness reframes the equation. Awareness allows the powerless to negotiate with predators, to invert hierarchy, to survive, and ultimately to command. When the Baroness's voice called from above, mocking, sweet, dangerous, the girl ignored it. She did not flinch. She did not falter. The dogs had already recognized the shift. They would obey the laws of dominance that existed inside the cellar, not the dictates of the human above them. And this is where the system, the one designed to crush, began to unravel. Emergence was inevitable. And when the trapdoor finally lifted, the world outside would witness the impossible. A girl who had been locked, starved, and surrounded by predators would walk into daylight not as a victim, not as prey, but as a figure commanding attention. Shaping perception, asserting control, the dogs would follow, not out of training alone, but out of recognition of her authority. A living testament to the failure of imposed power when met with calculated awareness. What history leaves out is this: her triumph was not brute force. It was cognitive mastery. It was patience, observation, and the unyielding refusal to internalize fear as instruction. She had inverted the hierarchy. She had rewritten the rules. And in doing so, she revealed a secret as old as civilization itself. The strongest mind is the one that sees the patterns others cannot, and uses them to survive, and ultimately, to dominate. The trapdoor creaked. Dawn's light spilled into the cellar, sharp and blinding after 3 days of darkness. The girl did not hesitate. She stepped forward, every movement deliberate, every breath measured. The dogs followed, not with aggression, not with hesitation, but with recognition. Bourbon, the alpha, led, his massive head level with hers. Eyes flicking between her and the perimeter, instinct acknowledging authority that had never been part of his training. The Baroness watched from above, disbelief etched into her face. Her perfect experiment, the calculated terror, the deprivation, controlled instruments of power, was failing before her eyes. All that she had believed absolute was dissolving in real time. The girl's calm had rewritten the hierarchy. The cellar, designed to crush her spirit, had forged her into a force the Baroness could not control. Stepping through the trapdoor, the girl emerged into the kennel room. 8 enormous dogs moved in perfect formation behind her. Muscles tense but obedient. Every action, a testament to a principle the Baroness had ignored. The mind is stronger than fear when it refuses to submit. She did not run. She did not beg. She did not scream. She walked with the quiet inevitability of someone who had studied her environment, understood it, and mastered it completely. Staff who witnessed the scene later described it in fragmented accounts. A girl of slight frame moving with absolute calm, followed by beasts that should have attacked, yet instead obeyed, deferred, and waited. Even Gasper Thibault, the overseer, who had once prided himself on controlling others through fear, could only watch, paralyzed by the impossibility of what he saw. Authority, it seemed, had a new center, and it was not the Baroness, The Baroness's expression shifted, darkening into something history rarely records. Shock, disbelief, and a faint tremor of fear. For once, her instruments of domination had recognized a new law, one she could not dictate. Hunger and aggression, carefully cultivated for obedience, had been redirected not through violence, not through intimidation, but through recognition of presence, awareness, and calculated calm. The girl paused at the threshold of the estate's main grounds, sensing the full extent of what she had accomplished. The dogs formed a perfect line behind her, their eyes fixed on her back, waiting for cues that had never existed before. What she had endured below was not simply punishment, it was preparation. Every calculated act of cruelty had become an insight, every deprivation a lesson in control and perception. The system that sought to enslave her had unknowingly trained her to master it. And in this moment, the lesson is universal. Fear, cruelty, and control are only as absolute as the mind that accepts them. Awareness is the ultimate weapon. Observation is the ultimate shield. Those who recognize patterns that others ignore can invert any hierarchy, bend any structure, and walk away unbroken, commanding forces that once sought to destroy them. The girl did not look back. She did not hesitate. She walked forward. 8 massive predators following her in perfect obedience, a living monument to the failure of absolute power when faced with unyielding awareness. She stepped onto the estate, grounds like a force that had rewritten reality itself. The dogs ate immense, ravenous beasts. Instruments of domination followed without question, their instincts recalibrated by a mind the Baroness could not touch. What had been designed to crush, to instill terror, to enforce obedience, had become the medium of her authority. She had inverted the very hierarchy built to enslave her, and in doing so, she had transformed survival into power. The Baroness, whose eyes had once ruled through fear, now realized too late that control is an illusion. Instruments of oppression can only dominate when the target accepts its role. Awareness, focus, and calm qualities the girl had honed over years of struggle turned the alpha dog into an ally, the pack into a silent army, and the cellar into a classroom of forbidden knowledge. She had learned the secret the Baroness would never understand. True mastery doesn't come from imposing power. It comes from understanding it, bending it, commanding it without lifting a hand. When she emerged fully into daylight, the world shifted. The staff and neighboring witnesses would later describe the scene as impossible, surreal. A girl of slight frame, eyes unbroken, followed by 8 massive beasts moving in perfect formation, exuding authority that no whip, no command, no fear could challenge. The Baroness's empire of terror, meticulously designed and brutally executed, had collapsed in silence. And with that collapse, a truth as old as civilization itself became undeniable. Systems of control, no matter how absolute they appear, are always vulnerable to awareness, patience, and strategic command. For those of you watching, the lesson is chilling and transformative. Life, institutions, hierarchies, they all assume compliance. They depend on fear, ignorance, and unchallenged authority. But if you observe, if you map the rules, if you understand the predictable patterns, you can invert the system. You can survive the impossible. You can become a force others instinctively recognize but cannot touch. The girl in that cellar didn't just endure, she emerged as a master of a world designed to enslave her. And now, as we conclude this descent into forbidden history, I want you to act. Comment twice below. I am the observer, I am the master. Let it anchor your awareness, your presence, your refusal to be controlled. Like this video if it unsettled and awakened you. Share it with someone ready to see beyond the surface of control and domination. History will always remember the outcomes, but rarely the method. Today, you've seen both. Survival not as chance, but as intelligence. Submission transformed into authority. Fear rewritten as insight. Let this story remind you that the strongest weapon a man possesses is his mind, the clarity to perceive patterns others ignore, and the courage to act within them. Welcome to the edge of forbidden knowledge. Welcome to the understanding few will ever achieve.
Ow!
And remember, power is not given, it is claimed.
Yes.
This concludes our journey into the cellar, the experiment, and the emergence. Welcome back to Fear, liturgy where the darkest truths teach the strongest lessons.